Aram Ilyich Khachaturian was born on June 6, 1903 in the city of Tiflis, although some sources, including Khachaturian himself, claim he was actually born in a village 20 kilometers away from Tiflis. In any case, Aram was the youngest of 5. His father Yegya was a bookbinding shop owner originally from the village of Upper Aza, and his mother Kumash was from Lower Aza. Both of his parents were Armenian, and were engaged to each other before they had even met. And as for their ages, Aram received his early education at a commercial school, and considered a career in either medicine or biology. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Tiflis was the largest city in the Caucasus. Aram would be exposed to various cultures during his childhood. The city also had a large Armenian population, and was a major center for Armenian culture. Khachaturian himself would say this about his experience in Tiflis later in life. In 1917, the Bolsheviks took power in Russia following the October Revolution. Armenia would declare its independence in May of 1918, surviving for over 2 years before falling to Soviet rule in late 1920. 2 years later, the country became the Armenian SSR. Later in life, Khachaturian would claim the October Revolution, quote, fundamentally changed my whole life. Khachaturian would move to Moscow in 1921 and enroll at the Ganesin Musical Institute. He initially began studying the cello, but would soon join Mikhail Ganesin's composition class in 1925. Some early compositions included the Dance Suite for violin piano and Poem in C-sharp minor. During his time studying composition, Khachaturian would transcribe folk songs from various countries including Russia, Hungary, Turkey, and his native Armenia. He then entered the Moscow Conservatory in 1929, studying composition under Nikolai Myaskovsky and orchestration under Sergei Vasilenko. In 1933, Khachaturian married his classmate Nina Makarova. She would say of their differences in style, quote, he is Armenian, temperamental, strong, and a bit oriental. I am Russian and lyric. The couple had 2 children named Nune and Karin. He would graduate from the conservatory in 1934 and finish his grad studies 2 years after that. Khachaturian wrote his first symphony in 1934, which musicologist Maya Pritzker says it, quote, drew the attention of prominent conductors and was soon performed by the best Soviet orchestras. The symphony would also receive the admiration of Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich. Khachaturian then wrote his piano concerto in 1936, which premiered in Moscow with Lev Oborin as a soloist. The performance was successful, causing Khachaturian to become a respected composer in the Soviet Union. It was also the first work to bring him recognition from the West. Khachaturian would be the first Soviet composer to write music for sound films, including the first Armenian sound film Pepo in 1935. Khachaturian would also hold important positions for the Union of Soviet Composers. This included the deputy chairman of the Moscow branch in 1937 and the deputy chairman of the organizing committee in 1939. According to UC Riverside professor Kirill Tomov, he used his positions to help shape Soviet music, which he took pride in. Khachaturian would travel to his native Armenia in 1939. The purpose of the trip, according to musicologist Carol Stein, was to, quote, make a thorough study of Armenian musical folklore and to collect folk song and dance tunes. Stein continues, saying, quote, he learned a lot, saw and heard many things anew, and at the same time he had an insight into the taste and artistic requirements of the Armenian people. The trip resulted in Khachaturian's first ballet, Happiness, which premiered in the Armenian capital of Yerevan. A year later, he wrote his violin concerto for Russian violinist David Oistrakh. The piece will win the Stalin Prize and has become one of Khachaturian's most well-known. In 1941, he would rework his ballet, resulting in Gayane. American dance critic Anna Kisselkoff will call the, quote, one of the staples of the Soviet and Eastern European ballet repertory. The ballet includes arguably his most famous piece, the Sabre dance. The 7th movement of the first Gayane suite was even used in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Khachaturian was awarded a second Stalin Prize for Gayane. Interestingly, he returned the money given to him from the prize, requesting it be used to build a tank for the Red Army. He then joined the Communist Party in 1933. Other pieces written around this time include his second symphony, written for the 25th anniversary of the October Revolution, Masquerade, and the state anthem of the Armenian SSR. In 1947, the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Agitprop for short, submitted a document to Secretary of the Communist Party Andrei Zhdanov regarding what they called shortcomings in the development of Soviet music. In response, a conference was held in the Kremlin where Zhdanov confronted about 70 musicians, one of them being Khachaturian. Quote, we will consider that if these comrades, Shostakovich, Prokofiev, Myaskovsky, Khachaturian, Kabalevsky, and Shevelin, namely who are the principal and leading figures of the formalist direction in music, and that direction is fundamentally incorrect. English journalist Andy McSmith describes the conference proceedings in his book Fear and the Muse Kept Watch as follows. Tikhon Khrennikov, head of the Union of Soviet Composers at the time, noted that the premiere of Khachaturian's Third Symphony, which was in Leningrad and conducted by Yevgeny Ravinsky, was in a half-empty hall. He would also say, quote, everyone thought that Khachaturian's cello concerto was rubbish. The concerto, by the way, was premiered in 1946 with Sviatoslav Knushevitsky as a soloist. Khachaturian, who was nervous during the conference, argued that composers who wrote more complex music could be guilty of ignoring popular tastes, believing those popular tastes would eventually catch up with them. Zhanov interrupted him by saying his attitude was, quote, extreme individualism. Eventually, Khachaturian and other composers were denounced by the Communist Party as formalists in 1948. Khachaturian's Third Symphony was singled out as an example of formalism, despite it ironically being written for the 30th anniversary of the October Revolution. Khachaturian himself would say of the work, quote, I wanted to write the kind of composition in which the public would feel my unwritten program without an announcement. I wanted this work to express the Soviet people's joy and pride in their great and mighty country. Musicologist Blair Johnson claims that it wasn't Khachaturian's music, but rather his administrative role in the Union of Soviet Composers, which was perceived as a, quote, bastion of politically incorrect music, as the reason for his denunciation. And while Khachaturian would apologize for his, quote, artistic errors, his musical style remained unchanged. The Soviet government sent Khachaturian to Armenia as a punishment and continued to censor him. Following Zhdanov's death in mid-1948 and his score for a Russian film about Lenin, Khachaturian will be returned to favor. Khachaturian would begin conducting and teaching at his alma mater starting in 1950. Some of his students included Talib Shakidi, Mark Minkov, and Aziz El-Shawan. Khachaturian strongly emphasized the importance of folk music to his students, believing that composers should master their nation's folk music heritage. Khachaturian would write his final ballet Spartacus in 1954, which would be his last internationally acclaimed work. The Adagio of Spartacus and Phrygia from the ballet was used in multiple films, including Caligula and Ice Age: The Meltdown. The same year he wrote his ballet, he would be named People's Artist of the USSR. Khachaturian would hold many positions in the Soviet government, including as a deputy in the Supreme Soviet in 1958. Khachaturian would also start touring, going to all the Eastern Bloc countries, Italy, the UK, Latin America, and the US. He was then admitted to a hospital in 1965 after a heart attack. Khachaturian would visit Washington, D.C. in 1968, conducting his works with the National Symphony Orchestra. Although he would focus less on composition for the rest of his life, some pieces written around this time include 3 concerto rhapsodies and 3 solo sonatas. One important aspect about Khachaturian would be his lifelong enthusiasm for communism. UNCG professor Jeffrey Adams would call him a, quote, loyal communist ideologue, devoted to making art relevant to the common worker. Khachaturian denied any censorship in his music, and will later say this regarding his 1948 denunciation. In addition, he would join other Soviet artists in calling on US President Richard Nixon to release Angela Davis, a Marxist activist who was arrested for her alleged role in the Marin County Civic Center attacks in 1970. He would also condemn Soviet nuclear physicist Andrei Sakharov for meeting with Western correspondents. Finally, on May 1, 1978, Aram Khachaturian died in Moscow. He was buried at the Komitas Pantheon in Yerevan next to many famous Armenians. His wife Nina had died 2 years earlier. According to James Box in his book A History of Russian-Soviet Music, Khachaturian was unique among Soviet composers for his blending of national Armenian musical intonations with contemporary orchestral techniques. His works cover a broad range of styles, the majority of which were written around World War II. Khachaturian is generally considered a nationalist composer, and is well known for his use of folk song from various ethnic groups. In his mature works, he would use elements of Ukrainian, Polish, Turkish, and Kurdish folk music. Ruben Paul Adalian, director of the Armenian National Institute in Washington, D.C., says that while Khachaturian's works carry the rhythm and pace of Caucasian dance music, they're reworked through European musical conventions. Khachaturian was largely influenced by folk song collector and Armenian priest Komitas. He argues that Komitas single-handedly laid the foundation for the Armenian classical tradition. In an article in 1969, Khachaturian would call Komitas his greatest teacher. Another influence on Khachaturian's music was the Russian classical tradition, and to an extent the Five. Russian-British musicologist Marina Folova-Walker would say of this, quote, never dissociating himself from the traditions of Russian music, he came to be regarded in Moscow as a mouthpiece of the entire Soviet Orient, gathering up all the diverse traditions into a grand generalization. Khachaturian and other socialist realist composers have left quite an influence both inside and outside of the Soviet Union. One group outside of the Soviet Union that's of particular note are Soviet-trained Chinese composers. Music critic Harold C. Schoenberg will call the Yellow River Piano Concerto by Chinese composer Yin Shenzong a, quote, rehash of Rachmaninoff, Khachaturian, late Romanticism, bastardized Chinese music, and Warner Brothers climaxes. Khachaturian's influence also extended Japanese composers such as Ro Ogura and Yasushi Akutagawa. Khachaturian is considered one of the greatest Soviet-era composers, along with Shostakovich, Prokofiev, and Dmitri Kabalevsky. Some have argued his death marked an end of an era among great Soviet composers. Music historian Harlow Robinson would say, quote, his proletariat origins, non-Russian ethnic origins, and Soviet training made him a powerful symbol within the Soviet musical establishment of the ideal of a multinational Soviet cultural identity, an identity which the composer enthusiastically embraced and exploited both at home and abroad. Khachaturian is held as a national treasure in Armenia, and is credited for bringing Armenian music worldwide recognition. Some have even called him the Armenian Tchaikovsky. Other interesting facts about Khachaturian include him having an asteroid and a school in Massachusetts of all places named after him, and he made a trip to Vatican City despite being an atheist.